October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday. The sky above Schweinfurt turned to blood. Inside the cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress, pilot Lieutenant John Anderson watched his instruments shudder as flak tore through the formation around him. To his left, a bomber named Lucky Lady disintegrated mid-flight, 4 engines and 10 men erased in a heartbeat of fire. To his right, another fortress tumbled earthward, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud. The radio crackled with screams, prayers, silence. Anderson's hands gripped the yoke as cannon shells from Messerschmitt fighters punched through his aircraft's aluminum skin. 1, 2, 3 holes appeared in the fuselage behind him, daylight streaming through steel. His ball turret gunner shouted coordinates. His waist gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Above them, below them, around them, the sky itself had become teeth. This was supposed to be impossible. The Germans had laughed when Boeing unveiled the 4-engined monster in 1935. They had called it wasteful, impractical, the fantasy of American industrialists who understood nothing of modern war. Even Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had dismissed the reports with a wave of his hand. "Let them build their flying warehouses," he reportedly said. "Our fighters will tear them apart like paper." But now, 8 years later, that paper was bleeding Germany white. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not born from glory. It was born from desperation, from a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except a handful of men who believed steel and altitude could rewrite the rules of war. When the prototype first rolled out of Boeing's Seattle factory on a summer morning in 1935, a newspaper reporter looked at the bristling gun turrets and christened it a flying fortress. The name stuck. But names mean nothing without proof, and proof was written in blood, altitude, and the slow, grinding mathematics of attrition. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why the Germans laughed, you must first understand what they believed. In the 1930s, as Europe rearmed and the world held its breath, 2 competing visions of air power emerged. Germany, rising from the ashes of Versailles, embraced the dive bomber and the medium twin-engine bomber. Speed, agility, tactical support for ground forces. This was the Luftwaffe's creed. Stukas screaming down on Polish cavalry. Heinkel bombers coordinating with panzer divisions. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war. The German High Command had considered strategic heavy bombing. Briefly, General Walther Wever, one of the Luftwaffe's founding architects, had championed a long-range 4-engine bomber program called the Ural Bomber. But when Wever died in an aircraft crash in June of 1936, his vision died with him. Hitler himself insisted that bombers must be capable of dive bombing, a requirement that made heavy 4-engine designs impractical. Germany would fight with medium bombers, tactical aircraft designed to support armies, not to level cities far beyond the front lines. America, isolated by oceans and insulated by geography, had different nightmares. In the years following World War I, American air theorists absorbed the writings of Italian strategist Giulio Douhet, who preached that future wars would be won not on battlefields but in the skies above industrial centers. Destroy a nation's factories, shatter its will to produce, and the armies would wither. This was not the warfare of knights and honor. It was the warfare of accountants and engineers. The United States Army Air Corps issued a specification in 1934 that read like science fiction. They wanted a multi-engine bomber capable of flying at 10,000 feet with a top speed of 250 miles per hour, with an endurance of 10 hours and a service ceiling of 29,000 feet. Most remarkably, it had to maintain level flight with one engine out, carrying a design load at 7,000 feet. 3 companies responded. Douglas and Martin submitted twin-engine designs, practical and conventional. Boeing, a company with just 600 employees struggling through the Great Depression, bet everything on something impossible, a 4-engine heavy bomber. The Boeing Model 299, as it was officially designated, was a gamble that nearly bankrupted the company. Boeing invested $432,034, equivalent to $9.2 million in today's currency, on a single prototype. If it failed, Boeing would collapse. If it succeeded, it would redefine warfare. On July 28, 1935, test pilot Les Tower lifted the Model 299 off the runway at Boeing Field in Seattle. The aircraft climbed smoothly, its 4 Wright Cyclone engines roaring with a combined 1,800 horsepower. It was sleek, massive, and unlike anything that had flown before. 3 weeks later, on August 20th, the prototype made a 2,100-mile non-stop flight from Seattle to Wright Field in Ohio in 9 hours, averaging 233 miles per hour. It shattered every existing record for distance and speed. The Army Air Corps was impressed. Contracts seemed certain, and then, on October 30th, 1935, disaster struck. During a demonstration flight at Wright Field, the Model 299 crashed on takeoff, killing 2 of the 5 crew members, including Les Tower himself. The cause was simple, heartbreaking, human. The pilot had forgotten to disengage the gust locks, mechanical devices that held the control surfaces during ground operations. The aircraft lifted off, climbed briefly, stalled, and plunged into the earth. Boeing had lost its prototype and, seemingly, its future. The Army awarded the 200 bomber contract to Douglas for their twin-engine B-18 Bolo, a safe, conventional design. The 4-engine dream appeared dead, but buried in the evaluation reports was a lifeline. Despite the crash, the Model 299 had outperformed every other aircraft in nearly every category. Through a bureaucratic loophole, the Army Air Corps ordered 13 pre-production models for testing and evaluation on January 17, 1936. These would become the Y-1B-17, the first true flying fortresses. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence monitored these developments with bemused skepticism. The Americans, it seemed, were building an absurdity, a bomber too large, too expensive, too slow to maneuver, too vulnerable to fighters. In the tactical warfare the Luftwaffe envisioned, such a beast would be a liability, not an asset. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing the Y-1B-17's defensive armament: 5 machine gun positions, bristling from nose, waist, ventral, dorsal, and tail positions. German analysts were unimpressed. Fighters would simply attack from angles the guns couldn't cover or overwhelm the fortress with numbers. Let the Americans waste their resources, one Luftwaffe memo reportedly concluded. Strategic bombing is a theory that will die in the first month of real war. But theories are tested in fire, and the fire was coming. Between 1936 and 1941, the B-17 evolved through multiple iterations. The early models B-17, B, C, and D were learning platforms, aircraft that revealed flaws and demanded solutions. They were underpowered, their defensive armament inadequate, their operational range limited. Only 197 of these early models were built before the United States entered World War II. By the time of Pearl Harbor, fewer than 200 flying fortresses existed, and most were stationed in the Pacific, not Europe. The British Royal Air Force received 20 B-17Cs in early 1940, desperately seeking any heavy bomber to strike back at Germany. They designated them Fortress Mark I and sent them on daylight raids. The results were catastrophic. On July 8, 1941, 3 fortresses attacked Wilhelmshaven. The mission was deemed unsuccessful. German fighters swarmed the isolated bombers, exploiting gaps in their defensive coverage. Within months, the RAF withdrew the B-17C from daylight operations, concluding that unescorted heavy bombers could not survive over Germany. The Germans took note. Their assessment seemed validated. The American fortress was indeed vulnerable, indeed flawed. When the United States officially entered the war on December 7, 1941, the Luftwaffe prepared to face the American bomber force with confidence bordering on contempt. But the Americans were learning. Every failed raid, every shattered bomber, every crew lost was a lesson written in blood and translated into modifications. The B-17E, introduced in September 1941, addressed the most critical vulnerabilities. A tail gunner position was enlarged and improved. The defensive armament grew from 5 to 9 50-caliber machine guns. Armor plating protected the crew. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from small arms punctures. The Boeing engineers, learning from British losses and Pacific combat, were creating not just a bomber, but a fortress. And then came the B-17F, and finally the B-17G, the definitive version that would dominate the skies over Europe. By the summer of 1943, the flying fortress bristled with 13 50-caliber machine guns, including a revolutionary chin turret beneath the nose to defend against head-on fighter attacks. Its crew of 10 pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners operated in a symphony of coordinated violence. At its service ceiling of 25,000 to 35,000 feet, it flew above the worst of German anti-aircraft fire. Inside its bomb bay, it could carry up to 8,000 pounds of high explosives. The B-17G could fly 300 miles per hour at altitude. Its range, with drop tanks, extended to nearly 2,000 miles. And most critically, it could absorb punishment that would shred lesser aircraft. Stories emerged of fortresses returning to base with engines shot out, tail sections nearly severed, fuselages riddled with hundreds of flak holes. One bomber returned to England with 179 flak holes and only 2 functioning engines. The pilot wrote to Boeing, "I'm glad to be alive. Thank you for making such a good airplane." But durability meant nothing without doctrine. The Americans believed in daylight precision bombing, a philosophy diametrically opposed to British nighttime area bombing. Using the top-secret Norden bomb sight, a gyroscopically stabilized telescopic sight coupled to an electromechanical computer, American bombardiers aimed to strike specific factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and military installations with surgical accuracy. The bomb sight was so classified that bombardiers were trained to destroy it rather than allow capture. It was reputed, perhaps optimistically, to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4,000 meters. Precision required daylight. Daylight required visibility. Visibility meant vulnerability. The doctrine rested on a single assumption, that massed formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to the target and back without fighter escort. This was the theory of the self-defending bomber, and it would be tested, again and again, in the blood-soaked skies above Germany. In October 1942, the Luftwaffe captured its first intact B-17. A damaged fortress, separated from its formation and limping across Holland, was forced down. German pilots had fired hundreds of rounds to disable it, astonished that the aircraft refused to die. The bomber was transported to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's experimental testing facility, and reassembled for examination. Senior Luftwaffe officers gathered around the wreckage like surgeons around an autopsy. What they found changed everything. The aircraft was clearly designed for daylight operations, 11 heavy machine gun positions, loaded with incendiary ammunition of a type then unknown to the Germans. The armor plating was extensive, the engines powerful, the structure reinforced far beyond anything Germany had designed for tactical bombers. From another crash site, they recovered an almost intact Norden bomb site. Combined with intelligence reports of extensive airfield construction across eastern England, the implications were terrifying. Colonel Adolf Galland, chief of day fighter squadrons and later general of fighter aircraft, examined the wreckage and reported, "It unites every possible advantage in one bomber. Firstly, heavy armor. Secondly, enormous altitude performance. And thirdly, devastating defensive firepower. This bomber will force us to rethink our entire fighter doctrine." Erhard Milch, State Secretary of the Reich Aviation Ministry and Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, was more blunt. After reviewing intelligence on American industrial production and seeing the fortress up close, he made a chilling prediction. "Things don't look rosy for our big cities. 1943 will be the year of clenched teeth." Hermann Göring dismissed the concerns. "We will fetch these 4-engine bombers down just as quickly as the twin-engined ones," he declared. Hans Jeschonek, Chief of General Staff, echoed this confidence. "The loss of a 4-engine bomber means a much higher loss to the enemy." We will make them bleed for every raid. They would have their chance to test that theory. By early 1943, the American 8th Air Force was assembling in England not dozens of bombers, but hundreds. Air bases sprouted across East Anglia, each one a logistical miracle of fuel, ordnance, spare parts, and crews. At the height of the war, B-17 seconds would occupy more than 25 airfields in southern and eastern England. Nearly 500,000 American servicemen supported the bombing campaign. On January 27, 1943, the 8th Air Force struck Germany for the first time. 58 B-17 seconds and B-24 Liberators attacked the port of Wilhelmshaven. It was a tentative probe, a test. The bombers returned with losses, but they returned. Over the next 7 months, the raids pushed deeper into Germany, each one more ambitious, each one bloodier. The bombers flew far beyond the range of Allied fighter escorts, relying solely on their defensive armament and tight formation flying. The Americans developed the combat box formation, a staggered three-dimensional arrangement where every bomber's guns could cover neighboring aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots called these formations Fliegendes Stachelschwein, flying porcupines, because attacking them meant flying into a wall of 50 caliber fire from every direction. But walls can be breached. The Luftwaffe adapted. Fighter pilots discovered that frontal attacks, diving from 12 o'clock high directly into the bomber's nose, offered the best chance of success. Early B-17 models had limited forward firepower, and even a brief burst could kill the pilot, co-pilot, and bombardier in a single pass. German fighters were equipped with heavier cannons, 20mm, and eventually 30mm weapons, capable of tearing through armor with explosive shells. German pilots learned that destroying a B-17 required patience and persistence. Intelligence reports revealed that it took an average of 20 hits with 20mm shells to bring down a flying fortress. Since the average German pilot hit only 2% of rounds fired, this meant emptying 1,000 rounds into a single bomber. Early Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters carried only 500 rounds per cannon. Later models were upgunned with 4 or even 6 cannons, creating Sturmbock bomber-destroyer variants specifically designed to kill fortresses. The Americans, meanwhile, refined their formations and tactics. They discovered that tighter spacing reduced individual maneuverability but maximized overlapping fields of fire. They developed assembly ships, aircraft painted in distinctive patterns to help formations coalesce quickly after takeoff, saving precious fuel. They synchronized bomb releases so entire formations dropped simultaneously, overwhelming German defenses and increasing the probability that at least some bombs hit the target. It became a brutal calculus. How many bombers must we lose to destroy one factory? How many men must die to knock out one oil refinery? The answer came on August 17, 1943, when the 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious operation yet, a twin strike against the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing production center at Schweinfurt, both deep in southern Germany. Regensburg lay 430 miles inside enemy territory. Schweinfurt housed 60% of Germany's ball-bearing manufacturing capacity, the tiny precision components that kept every machine of war turning. 376 flying fortresses took off from English airfields that morning. The plan called for the formations to penetrate German airspace together, then split south of Frankfurt. 230 bombers would strike Schweinfurt and return to England. 146 would continue to Regensburg, bomb the Messerschmitt factory, then fly south over the Alps to land in Algeria, a one-way mission to avoid flying the gauntlet twice. Dawn found the airfields shrouded in thick fog. The Regensburg force took off first, bursting through the clouds into sunlight. The Schweinfurt force delayed, waiting for weather to clear. This split the attack, sacrificing the mutual protection of massed formations. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighter controllers tracked the American bombers from the moment they crossed into occupied Europe. Over 300 fighters, Me 109 seconds, Foe 190 seconds, and twin-engine destroyer aircraft scrambled from bases across France and Germany. They had time to refuel, rearm, and attack in successive waves. The Regensburg force fought its way across Germany in a running battle that lasted hours. Fighters hit them from every angle, head-on passes at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, diving attacks from above, climbing attacks from below. Bombers fell from formation, trailing fire, or spinning out of control. Some disintegrated mid-air when cannon shells ignited fuel or detonated bomb loads. Parachutes blossomed like pale flowers against the blue sky, each one a man falling into captivity or death. 24 bombers from the Regensburg force were destroyed, but they reached the target, dropped their bombs with devastating accuracy, and fled south over Austria. The Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg was reduced to smoking rubble. Production halted for months. The Schweinfurt force, arriving hours later without the protective cover of the Regensburg attack, suffered even worse. German fighters, rearmed and refueled, threw themselves at the formations with suicidal intensity. 36 flying fortresses went down over Germany. 5 more crashed on approach to England. 12 landed so damaged they were scrapped immediately. Of the 376 B-17 seconds that departed England, 60 were destroyed outright. Another 55 were damaged beyond immediate repair or lost on follow-up missions. In total, 118 bombers, nearly one-third of the committed force, were gone. Of the 2,900 men who flew that day, approximately 650 did not return. Some survived, and as prisoners of war. Most did not. Only 33 bombers landed without damage. The American High Command called it a success. Both targets had been hit. German war production was disrupted, but the losses were unsustainable. At this rate of attrition, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist within months. 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids into Germany. The self-defending bomber doctrine, that foundational assumption upon which the entire strategic bombing campaign rested, had been proven false. The flying fortress could not fight its way unescorted to targets deep in Germany and return, not against swarms of determined fighters, not without bleeding itself dry. The Germans celebrated, the Americans had been stopped, the fortress had been breached. But salvation was already being forged in factories and training fields across America and England. A new fighter, the North American P-51 Mustang, was entering service, an aircraft with the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. With drop tanks, the Mustang could fly as far as the fortresses themselves, turning the bomber boxes from isolated prey into protected convoys. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation came swiftly. On September 27, 1943, 305 B-17 seconds struck the German port of Emden. For the first time, fighter escorts protected the bombers all the way to the target. The P-47 Thunderbolts, fitted with new drop tanks, cleared the skies of Luftwaffe fighters. Only 7 bombers were lost. The escorts shot down 20 German fighters, while losing just one of their own. The equation had changed. By December 1943, the P-51 Mustang arrived in England. With drop tanks extending its range to nearly 2,000 miles, the Mustang could escort B-17 seconds all the way to Berlin and back. The Americans had created what the Germans thought impossible: a long-range escort fighter with performance equal to or superior to the Luftwaffe's best interceptors. The fortress was no longer alone. The transformation came swiftly, brutally. Operation Argument, later dubbed Big Week, commenced on February 20, 1944. For 6 consecutive days, American and British bombers hammered German aircraft factories in Leipzig, Brunswick, Gotha, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Steyr. Over 3,500 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds flew more than 3,500 sorties, protected by hundreds of Mustangs and Thunderbolts that engaged the Luftwaffe wherever it rose to defend. The Americans lost 247 B-17 seconds during Big Week, approximately 7% of the attacking force. In 1943, that same loss rate would have been considered a triumph, but now, with fighter escorts swarming German interceptors, the bombers could sustain operations indefinitely. The 8th Air Force could replace 247 bombers in weeks. The factories in America worked faster than the bombers could be destroyed. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost over 1/3 of its available fighting strength in 6 days. Hundreds of fighters destroyed, hundreds of pilots killed or wounded, and worst of all, the factories that built replacement aircraft were burning. One German pilot, Johannes Steinhoff, wrote in his journal, "We rise to meet them knowing we cannot win. Every mission now is survival, not victory. The sky belongs to them." By March 6, 1944, Berlin itself came within reach. The first major daylight raid on the German capital sent over 600 B-17 seconds, escorted by Mustangs deep into the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had left into the defense. Over 160 fighters rose to intercept. It was the Luftwaffe's Götterdämmerung, its twilight of the gods. 69 B-17 seconds were shot down that day. Their wreckage burned across Brandenburg and Mecklenburg, but 160 German fighters were destroyed. Veteran pilots who could never be replaced, aircraft that represented months of scarce production. The Americans mourned their losses and launched another raid the next week. The Germans mourned theirs and watched their air force die. For the B-17 crews, the missions remained deadly. Each sortie over Germany was a lottery where survival depended on formation, discipline, crew coordination, and luck. Anti-aircraft flak remained a constant threat. German 88mm guns fired shells that burst at altitude, spraying shrapnel through formations like steel rain. On some missions, flak was so thick that pilots said you could walk on it. One B-17 returned to England with over 200 flak holes. Another landed with 3 engines destroyed and the tail gunner killed at his post. Inside the bombers, men endured cold that froze exposed skin in seconds. At 30,000 feet, temperatures plunged to 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Oxygen was scarce. Frostbite and hypoxia claimed lives as surely as enemy fire. Ball turret gunners, cramped in their spherical gun positions beneath the fuselage, could not wear parachutes. If the aircraft went down, they were trapped. The statistics were merciless. During the first year of the campaign over Germany, only 36% of bomber crews completed their required 25-mission tour. The rest were shot down, captured, wounded, or killed. In the 8th Air Force, more than 26,000 airmen died, more fatalities than the entire United States Marine Corps suffered in World War II. Another 23,000 were wounded. 28,000 became prisoners of war. One survivor, John Lucky Luckadoo of the legendary Bloody 100th Bomb Group, recalled the terror. Every mission, you watched friends die. You'd see a bomber next to you explode, and 10 men you'd had breakfast with were gone. Then you'd land, write letters to their families, and fly again the next day. You couldn't think about it. You just had to keep going. But they kept going. Every day the weather permitted, formations of flying fortresses lifted off from English airfields. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force could put over 1,000 bombers in the air simultaneously, a fleet that darkened the sky like a migrating swarm. German civilians, looking up, saw hope extinguished. One Berliner wrote in her diary, "The sky turned black with their bombers. There were so many that the sun disappeared. We knew then that the war was lost." The targets shifted as Germany's industrial capacity crumbled. After big week shattered aircraft production, the bombers turned to oil refineries. Germany's synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Politz and Merseburg became priority targets. The Reich needed oil to move its tanks, fuel its aircraft, power its war machine. On May 12, 1944, the oil campaign began. In 1 month, the Americans dropped 5,000 tons of bombs on these refineries. By August, the tonnage increased to 26,000 tons. In November, it peaked at 35,000 tons. The effects were catastrophic for Germany. Fuel production collapsed. Luftwaffe fighters sat grounded on airfields, unable to fly for lack of aviation gasoline. Panzer divisions crawled to a halt, their tanks empty. When Hitler launched his final desperate offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, his armoured spearheads ground to a stop, not because of Allied resistance, but because they ran out of fuel. The Flying Fortress had strangled the Wehrmacht's ability to move. The bombing was not surgical. Despite the Norden bomb site's theoretical precision, most bombs missed their intended targets. Weather, smoke, flak, and human error scattered ordnance across German cities. Civilians died by the tens of thousands. In Berlin, alone, over 363 air raids killed approximately 20,000 people and left 1.7 million homeless. 40% of the population fled the city. The moral cost of strategic bombing remains debated to this day, a shadow that follows the legacy of the Flying Fortress. But the military impact was undeniable. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Allied bombers roamed German skies with near impunity. The P-51 Mustangs, after escorting bombers to their targets, descended to strafe trains, trucks, and airfields, hunting anything that moved. Germany's transportation network collapsed. Factories stood idle for lack of raw materials. The industrial engine that had powered the Wehrmacht ground to a halt. One German factory worker, interrogated after the war, described the transformation. In 1942, we believed we were invincible. By 1944, we worked in the ruins. The bombers came every day. We repaired what we could, but it was pointless. For every machine we fixed, 10 more were destroyed. The B-17 had achieved what skeptics thought impossible. It had proven that strategic bombing, when combined with long-range fighter escorts and industrial production on an unprecedented scale, could cripple a modern nation's ability to wage war. Not alone, never alone, but as part of a coordinated campaign that married American industrial might with technological innovation and the courage of men willing to die in frozen, flak-torn skies. By April 27, 1945, the last heavy bombing mission over Europe was flown. 2 days later, on April 29th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. 1 week later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Flying Fortress had helped crush the Reich. The final accounting was staggering. Over 12,730 B-17 seconds were built during the war. The bomber equipped 32 overseas combat groups. At its peak in August 1944, 4,574 B-17 seconds were in service worldwide. These aircraft flew over 290,000 sorties and dropped 640,000 tons of bombs on Nazi Germany and occupied territories more than any other American aircraft in the war. But the cost matched the achievement. Approximately 4,700 B-17 seconds were lost in combat or accidents over Europe. Tens of thousands of airmen died, were wounded, or spent years in prisoner of war camps. The bomber that was supposed to defend itself had proven that no aircraft, no matter how heavily armed, could survive without fighter protection. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber died in the flak-filled skies above Schweinfurt and Regensburg, buried alongside the men who believed in it. The Germans, who had laughed in 1935 at the impractical American flying warehouse, learned too late what the fortress truly was. Not invincible, not unstoppable, but relentless. A manifestation of American industrial power that could absorb losses, replace aircraft, and return day after day until the enemy had nothing left with which to resist. Hermann Göring, captured at war's end, was asked what had doomed Germany. He answered simply, "We could not match American production. For every bomber we shot down, 3 more appeared. We fought not an air force but a factory." Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe ace and fighter commander, was more philosophical in his memoirs. The Flying Fortress was not the best bomber. The Mosquito was faster, the Lancaster carried more bombs. But the B-17 came in formations of hundreds, protected by swarms of fighters, supplied by an industrial machine we could never defeat. We fought with courage. They fought with mathematics. Mathematics won. After the war ended, surviving B-17 seconds returned to America or were scrapped in place. Thousands of aircraft, still operational, were cut apart for aluminum. Some found new life as transport planes, reconnaissance platforms, or air-sea rescue aircraft dropping life rafts to downed crews. A few became firebombers, fighting wildfires across the American West. By 1968, the last B-17 seconds were retired from military service. Today, only 4 flying fortresses remain airworthy, preserved by museums and aviation enthusiasts as flying memorials to the men who flew them. Visitors can walk through their cramped interiors, touch the gun positions, sit in the bombardier's seat, and look through the plexiglass nose at the earth below. The aircraft feel impossibly small for the legends they carried. At air shows, when these restored B-17 seconds take flight, elderly men who once flew in them stand and weep. They remember friends who never came home, missions flown through walls of fire, the bone-deep cold at 30,000 feet. One veteran, watching a B-17 fly overhead at an air show in Ohio, whispered to his grandson, "That sound, those 4 Wright Cyclone engines, I hear that in my dreams. Sometimes it's a nightmare, sometimes it's a prayer." The wreckage of shot-down flying fortresses still lies scattered across Europe. In German forests, farmers occasionally find twisted aluminum buried in the earth, fragments of bombers that fell 75 years ago. Each wreck is a grave, a reminder that 10 men once breathed, laughed, feared, and died inside that steel coffin falling from the sky. The Germans laughed when Boeing built a 4-engine bomber in 1935. They called it wasteful, vulnerable, an expensive fantasy. But the laughter died somewhere above Schweinfurt, or perhaps over Berlin, or maybe in the ruins of factories that would never produce another aircraft. The fortress had fulfilled its purpose not through invincibility but through persistence, not through individual survival but through collective sacrifice. In the end, the B-17 flying fortress wrecked not 1,000 targets but entire industrial regions. It helped break the Luftwaffe's back, starved the Wehrmacht of fuel, and proved that air power, properly applied with enough resources and enough willing men, could bring a modern nation to its knees. The fortress flew, the fortress bled, the fortress won, and in its wake, it left a sky full of ghosts, American boys who climbed into aluminum coffins each morning and flew toward death because someone had to, because the cause demanded it, because turning back meant the war would never end. They flew the flying fortress not because it was invincible, but because it was all they had. And somehow, terribly, beautifully, it was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.